and welcome everyone to the DeakinCo Lab webinar, Diversity of Skills, the Building Blocks of Organisational Performance. I'm Campbell, CEO at DeakinCo, and your moderator today. We've brought together 3 talented leaders to help us explore how leading organisations are acknowledging and building skill diversity to help power teams to work better and facilitate organisational agility. First up, we're joined by Arti Yendidis. Arti is a partner at Deloitte, leading their workforce activations team and committed to developing and shaping leaders' ability to guide their people through large and complex transformations. Joining Arti is Jane Wan, Deputy Director at the New South Wales Government's Centre for Property Acquisition. Jane has extensive experience leading transformation initiatives across the engineering, construction, and infrastructure industries for government and the private sector. Our third panellist today is Lainey Taylor, Managing Director at HR Squad and also General Manager of People at Carmen's Kitchen. As founder of HR Squad, she is passionate about building capable and engaged organisations and leaders. I'd like to express my personal thanks to our panellists for joining us today. Now for today's webinar, Diversity of Skills. Skills are the building blocks of organisational performance. In some of DeakinCo's past research conducted with Deloitte Access Economics, some research we did there on soft skills and the importance these play in driving organisational performance, our research identified the need to have a diverse set of skills across individuals, teams, and the organisation. Organisations have and continue to place significant and important value on diversity. But to be truly diverse, the thinking needs to go beyond gender, age, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and spiritual practice. All of these are important, but diversity also includes flexibility of thought, leadership, and communication styles, among many others. To put it more directly, diversity requires and demands the soft human skills to drive performance across teams and organisations. Arti, I'll ask you the first question. If we think about flexibility of thought, leadership and communication styles, of these, what are the most important to drive organisational growth and performance?
Thank you for the question, Glenn. When we look at our research, and you referenced some of the research that we did together earlier, what we've seen over the last 20 years is that there's been, when we're looking at how work's shifting and the types of roles that are growing, what the research identified was that it's a non-routine based roles based on the non-routine requirements in relation to work, which is increasing more than other types of work. So when I think about non-routine work, what this means to me is that it's first-time problem solving each and every time. So when we're thinking about communication style or leadership or thought, when you're solving a first-time problem, it requires the ability to be flexible in relation to each of those elements. So I think it's all 3.
Thanks very much. Lainey, I'll return to you. Sort of 2 questions. From your experience, do you agree with Arti? Could be a loaded question there. The second part of that is, in your work across public and private companies of a whole variety of sizes, what do you see organisations doing well and where they can improve to drive achievement in their objectives?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't disagree with Arti at all and his answer, and obviously the research supports that. I think, it can differ between organisations, but I really think that all those 3 things are really important, but what really underpins it for me is the consistency of those things. So how do we make sure that they're embedded within an organisation the leadership skills, the communication skills in particular. And I would probably say if you had to put one above around consistency within an organisation to achieve the goals, that would be the one for me that I see that falls down or takes a back seat when pressure is applied to a strategy or a business. But I don't disagree that they're all important, but that would be sort of what I see within the smaller and larger organisations would be the communication and the consistency of all those three things.
Fantastic. And Jane, drawing on your experience in implementing a variety of different programs, how does what both Lainey and Artie say correlate with your experience?
Yeah, I'll touch on that point of consistency with Lani. So the Centre for Property Acquisition is an entity, it's a whole of government entity that looks after all of the acquisition of land when building infrastructure. So we work across 66 different acquiring agencies in the government and non-government, and also approximately 136 different councils. So back in 2016, there was a lot of complaints at the time about the way people were interacting. It was very transactional. And the government's purpose was to bring about consistency in the way people operate, but not only just to carry out a transaction, but to be easy to engage, to act with empathy, to be able to respect people's time, to resolve a situation, and also be engaging with the community. So we had a workforce that was employed for their technical skills, and they were very, very good at that. But we needed to identify what other human behavioural skills did they need to have to be able to drive good customer service.
Yeah. Thanks, Jane. And if I can just maybe we elaborate a little bit on that. What was the driver, you've sort of touched on a little bit around some of those drivers about why you needed to uplift capability.
Yeah.
What was it that was needed to actually help achieve and exceed those outcomes? What did you go about doing?
Okay, so there was a review into the practices back in 2017, a couple of reviews, and we identified what the customer pain points were, and then we mapped that against what people are currently doing as per their job description. We then looked for skills gaps, and what we found was there was a lot of people who were very experienced in the technical component of their job, but they weren't confident in engaging with different cultures or engaging with different types of people or dealing with conflict, or there's a lot of negotiation in a heated situation when we're acquiring land from people who don't want it or don't even expect it. So we needed to improve those sorts of skills in others to able to deliver and bring about some consistency in this industry.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It really is quite you've heard me say this many times. I think it's one of the hardest jobs in government when you're dealing with that compulsory acquisition of property.
Yeah.
And I'm in awe at the people that you have that can actually perform that function and do it so compassionately and like you said, consistently over time.
Yeah, and people are distressed, and we need to be able to put ourselves into their shoes, act with empathy. But who teaches things like that? It's something that's learned perhaps on the job, or what we're trying to do is, educate people through, training programs or mentoring programs, or showing what good looks like, and then rewarding those people with some recognition that they actually have those skills.
Thanks, Jane. Artie, I might just turn to you for a moment. Just having a reflection on what Jane's just described about the work that they're doing at the Centre for Property Acquisition. When you're asked to come in and consult for clients, what are the signs for you to identify what changes are required?
Yeah, that's another great question, Glenn. I think the trigger point for us to have conversations around capability and capability uplift, Jane's example is a typical one. I think the other way that our clients typically have a trigger for capability uplift conversations is when there's a change in organisational strategy. So if there's a change in organisational strategy, and we're seeing this more and more now, which is fantastic, it's a C-level conversation in relation to, well, these are the technical, professional, human capabilities that we're going to require across our organisation in order to deliver on our organisational strategy. So that's at the enterprise level. I think the other way is when we're talking about business units or functions. I think that's where it's typically off the back of a review or a capability assessment, where there's some data that's pointing to particular skills or capabilities that may have gaps across the workforce.
Yep. So who is it in an organisation that normally drives this conversation? Does it sit with L&D, or are you finding it's actually coming from other parts of the business?
So more and more we're seeing it come from other parts of the business, as well as from either organisational development or learning and development. I think when it's an enterprise-wide approach that our clients are seeking to drive, it's either through HR or it's through one of the other executives. And then when we're looking at business unit specific interventions or transformations, it's usually the leader of that function. So it's a combination of the two, I think, Glenn.
Yep. Would you, and I might open this up to the whole panel, are there tips or hints that you could have to assist L&D practitioners become involved or take a lead and drive this conversation?
Glenn, what I found is if the organisation has values that are focused on those human skills, then typically L&D will take the lead to ensure that the staff have those skills. So they'll put in programs for that. But I do believe that L&D need to reach out to the operations, because the operations are at the coalface, and they'll be able to tell you in real time what is actually missing. So they will be able to explain to you what assistance L&D can provide to the solution. I lead an area that's operational right across New South Wales. Now, if they didn't speak to me, I'd find it difficult to understand that whole industry and what can be delivered and what can't. But I can actually come up with the problems. I'll explain what we need to do and get the assistance of L&D to make that happen.
I'll just add to that what Jane said, her experiences within organisations, and I've certainly been in those situations as well. I think back to some of what Artie said around strategy. So where an L&D practitioner can really add value is when you've got strategic priorities in place for an organisation that may not be successful or may be a little bit off the rails, and often a leadership team may be quite focused on operationally how they can fix that strategic priority. But where I feel like OD can really step in is to represent the human aspect of work and bring that together with the strategic priority to find the gap. And that might be a capability gap, and I'm sure Artie could talk to, the things that they uncover, and I'm very big on data and audits and things like that. Sometimes it's a people thing, sometimes it's the diversity skill that we're talking about, and then sometimes it is operational. But everything will feed back through people, and I think it's really important that OD and L&D have a voice around the solution once it's been mapped against the strategic problem that's playing out for an organisation.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lainey. In fact, just sort of that very topic really, and where we're seeing the impacts and where that strategic thinking is coming from is really interesting. And our latest research that we've done with Deloitte Access Economics, again, is due to come out in the next month or so. So keep your eyes on that. But we start to see some of that comment coming out through that research in organisations across Australia around what are those skill gaps, skill uplifts that are needed in organisations in Australia today. And again, having already had a glimpse at some of that research, it's not that dissimilar to some of the things that we've seen in some of the other markets that we operate in, like India, but from some different purposes. Artie, we started today off with looking at three particular skills around flexibility of thought, leadership, and communication. I'm interested to know through your work what specific capabilities organisations are predominantly seeking to lift or build.
Yeah, so Glenn, I think when I think about the answer to that question, it goes back to a point that Lainey made earlier, where there is a lot of diversity. It does depend very much on the strategy of the organisation or the function itself. So it's very very anchored to strategy. But if I was to aggregate it all up and identify three, I think the three biggest ones that we hear a lot about are customer. So whether that's customer service, customer focus, but a customer orientation, so skills and capabilities associated with that. Digital fluency would be another big one. And then the third one, and surprising to me, we're hearing more about this now than what we have had in the past, whilst it's always been an important capability, a critical capability, but we're hearing more and more around the need associated with uplifting it is leadership.
Thanks, Artie. It's quite interesting. I think even from the work that we do at DeakinCo, the first two you mentioned, customers and digital fluency, were there pre-COVID, and that came out in the last report we did with you. But that leadership one, we've seen a huge increase as well in our business, particularly as we're in the era of COVID, if I can call it that. Won't fall into the trap of calling it in a post-COVID era anymore. So, yeah, that's certainly been one that we've noticed as well. Jane, does this marry with your experience? And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so for me as head of a whole of government entity, I am a customer to L&D. So I will actually explain to L&D what our goal is, and our goal is to be customer focused and consistent right across government. And it doesn't matter what policies and procedures are in place. If we don't have people who can understand and follow expectations, nothing will be successful. So where L&D came into value for me is I explained what the goal was. I said what we need to do is we look at the current skill sets of our people, match it against the customer pain points, and come up with a capability set that clearly defines what technical skills, what human skills, and what process skills people need to have. Where L&D added value for me is they actually came up with the 70-20-10 program in terms of learning. And through that, they were able to identify all these different ways and creative ways of embedding that knowledge and training people up on the identified skill sets that we said are required.
Oh, thanks, Jane. Lainey, I want to just sort of shift gear a little bit. How do the entrepreneurs that you work with address skill diversity, and particularly those that are really in that fast growth phase of their life?
So just acknowledge, Jane, I love that example, a great example of, the business working with L&D, and that's really pleasing and nice to hear when I've been out of big businesses for a while. I think I work with a lot of private industry entrepreneurial organisations. That's a big part of what HR Squad does, and there's lots of failings there, but there's also some really good learnings for bigger businesses that I think are always scalable. And I think it's that ability to kind of just really think outside the square around capability. So one thing those types of businesses are better at are taking risks on talent and promoting people with really good human skills, soft skills, human skills, without the technical, but being able to catch them if it's not working or support them in a way that allows that person to be successful. I see that more prevalent in the entrepreneurial space than I do with my other bigger, more corporate clients. I also, just to put a different lens on it for the L&D people or OD people that might be here, one thing that we've been doing a lot lately with our clients is with a lack of skills set and people in the industry is looking at teams from a human skill perspective versus individuals. So we're very familiar with doing talent reviews and talking about individuals against capabilities, against roles. But unfortunately, these are unprecedented times, and we need to think really outside the square and how we look at teams and resource. And so I think looking at that from a team perspective, a lot of my entrepreneurial clients have been very open to do that and looking at where people are strong and where they're not, and where we can put mentors or how we can take someone in a role a little bit further to cover someone's development area so that the whole team's delivering against the customer experience or the customer want. So I think that's something that's been emerging nowhere that I've read, just in the work that I'm doing, that I'm finding really interesting and my clients are finding really interesting.
Great, thanks. How sometimes what we often hear is, well, that's great for an entrepreneurial business or a startup business, but it won't work in an established one.
Yeah, get this question all the time. I'm already ready.
So, okay, so what would you actually say to the established business on that one? How can they learn from startups?
Yeah, look, I think I can't think of anything, and I did talk about this recently in a presentation, anything that I do with my entrepreneurial clients or even small organisations that can't be upscaled, can't be scaled up, because you can put these things in a team. As a leader of a business, you could just try it in your team. You can do pilot programs. Everything's scalable, right? It's just how you can put a process around it and map it back to the strategy. There has to be strategic priorities. It has to make sense and it has to filter through and it has to have a great operating rhythm around it. So that's what I think. And I also feel that another thing that's really important is motivation. When we're talking about human skills, we can tell people what they need to have, but are they motivated? And when we've got really technical people in roles, we need to measure where they're motivated to want to learn. So that's another piece I'd put around it. When you're doing these diversity skill pieces of work and big capability builds within an organisation against a strategy, the motivation has to be in the business, and you have to be able to measure the motivation in an individual.
It sort of brought something up for me. Artie, I'll ask you, I think, what are the key interventions, let me just phrase that again. What are the key interventions organisations are looking to implement?
So
particularly around capabilities, yeah.
What we're seeing at the moment, Glenn, is again, more so than any other time that I've been involved in this space, is a key need to be able to name capabilities. So a very clear requirement to have a taxonomy associated with skills and capabilities, so that when part A of an organisation is looking to uplift customer, it means the same thing in part A as it does in part B. So I think whether we're talking about capability frameworks or competency frameworks or skills taxonomies, you see different things, on the internet and in different points of view associated with their utility. But we're absolutely seeing in Australia and outside of Australia, that being the key foundation associated with any capability transformation. I think the next evolution that we're starting to see from a learning specific perspective is the movement towards learning in the flow and adding elements, adding other continuous learning components on top of education. So Lainey mentioned, mentoring. She mentioned, you didn't say the word secondment, Lainey, but different ways of uplifting capability. So what we're starting to see is a real drive towards not formalizing, but having a cultural shift in relation to how learning is delivered across the organisation and how it's perceived, and really putting learning and capability uplift interventions at the point of need, so in the flow of work. Yeah. And if I can add just one more, I think the other key trend that we're seeing, sorry, Jane, are capability academies. So these setting up constructs associated with either specific capabilities or specific functions in alignment with the broader enterprise learning strategy.
Mm-hmm. I have to agree with you, Artie. When about naming capabilities, we used to refer to this as we need to uplift soft skills, and people would say, I don't know what you're talking about. So we started to name them. We said, you've got to be good at conflict management. You need to be good at communication skills. And I'm not talking about how well you write. It's about how well you interact with somebody. It doesn't matter what business that you're in. It's about relationship building. So do you need to adjust the way you speak, the timing, how you respond to people when they're upset, and also the motivation. So what we did was we named the skills and we categorised the skills, and we said, okay, everybody, the future state is everybody must have these 3 skills at different levels depending on your level of experience. But what we found when we put programs to uplift people where they have gaps, that they didn't find interpersonal skills that important. So it became an optional thing. My future goal is to be able to mandate that those skills are absolutely crucial to business success and make people or motivate people to attend programs that help them develop those particular skills.
Thanks, Jane. And look, I've been on a bit of a crusade for the past few years to try and get rid of the phrase soft skills. But unfortunately, Google is defeating me by not having human skills or an alternate term within search engine optimization. So, but I think you're right, and that's part of it because as we all know, these are anything but soft. They're actually the things that are human, the things that Artie talked about as being those non-routine skills. Let's go to a couple of questions at this point in time, and I'm just going to jump down and have a read of these. So give me a quick moment. Okay, I might just take this one here from Keith. Panelists, and feel free to jump in, panel. How would you measure that motivation for change of an individual?
I reckon Artie can take this one. He's the measure man.
At an individual level, how would you measure
the motivation for change for an individual?
So I think there are a few, and I don't want to get all psychological on everybody as a psychologist in the virtual room, but I think there are methods of doing so. So if you're looking at implementing an intervention at the individual level, I would highly recommend utilising the various tools that are out there. So, motivation aligns to a few different things. Values, personal values being one. The other is your personality attributes and appetite for different things. So I would absolutely be leveraging those as an input into understanding the extent to which the individual has an appetite for change.
Yeah.
I would add to that, I think, personally in the coaching, executive coaching I do, that I think being able to self-analyze how motivated you are and really get to the core of that through either sprint coaching with someone or really understanding, as Artie said, what drives and motivates you and not getting that mixed up with what you're passionate about. Because when then those two things bang in together at work, you can get very confused about what you're good at or what you want to be good at or what you actually want to focus on. So you can very quickly unpick, Keith, the people that are motivated when you put things in front of them to be able to fill their cup and how engaged they are in that and how inquisitive they are or how vulnerable they feel in that situation. But I think self-assessment around motivation for me is the easiest way to do it, especially if you are lacking budget, and then you can take it from there in terms of really getting a benchmark of where that person's sitting. When you've got someone who's very technically driven and maybe sitting in a very technical role, they need to have that self-assessment for you to engage them, as Jane said, in some of those human skills training that they feel it's valuable or worthwhile.
I absolutely agree with you, Lani. I think everyone wants to be successful and do well in their job. Unfortunately, sometimes motivation comes from bad feedback. So someone might complain about a certain aspect of the way you performed your job. Or what I'd like to do is I'd like to have people understand themselves. So doing a DISC or a Myers profile to understand what type of person they are. Are they task-oriented? Are they people persons? Then they can self-reflect on that. Plus they get a 360 review from people who work around them to say, what do you think I do well? Or where do you think I can improve? So someone has to really be motivated to improve themselves to actually get somewhere and move. But I think getting some feedback from different areas, doing a self-assessment, understanding yourself will actually help you to identify that, perhaps technical skills aren't enough, that you need to do other areas of training or cultivate other areas of your work. It's like dealing with people to be able to be the best performer.
Thanks. There's in a number of the learning interventions that we do, there is a there's a free self-reflective piece that comes from Purdue University around readiness for change, and it looks at 7 traits that impact on readiness. I think by the looks of it, Artie, you know the one I'm talking about. We use that quite often because it's a good free resource that's easily available on the web that people can use as a guide to help their self-reflection. I'm just going to go to a couple more questions. There's one here from Vicky. How do the panellists measure if a skills diversity solution has been successful, and how long does this process take?
So for us, Glenn, we, as you know, partnered with you. So Centre for Property Acquisition partnered with DeakinCo to identify some credentialing programs to actually prove that people have these skills. And what we found is not only the end result, which is having a credential badge, but actually going through, they self-reflect, they identify what skills they believe that they have and what level. And once we go through the program, what the feedback has been, well, you know, actually, this particular area, there are some examples of how I can be better. So that they start to think about, you know, what can I do? What haven't I done? You know, what should I do in the future in this particular area? So like conflict management, they say, you know, Deakin actually gives you examples of what good looks like, and then they go to do that practically on their job.
There is a question here from someone who's asked about what are some of the 70 and 20 in the 70-20-10 model, so the 70 and the 20 initiatives that you've used, and how have they worked? Do you think they've worked well? I know we've talked about some of them, and I think this is when that question came up. What are some of the ones that you're finding that are probably the ones that work better?
So we've got, so if I can speak again. So some of the programs that we have is the training, which is a large offering, but there's a cost with that. So even though people might want to develop the skills, there are barriers such as budgets and different things that prohibit them or stop them from developing more skills. But what we do hold is something called a community of practice, where we bring together the industry, different roles, different agencies, and they talk to one another, and we share insights. And it's learning through each other that I think is the biggest area and the fastest area of learning.
I would agree with that. Within a business, that's nearly that mentoring, coaching piece. I think having a safe place to be mentored or coached internally or externally, for me, has always been the fastest route to learning, and then being able to, because that's where you get to talk about examples and things that you've learned in the 70% to be able to apply into the workforce. So I agree with Jane, and sorry, I know Artie, you were going to add something there.
No, that's all good, Lenny. I think you gave the affirmation just as I was going to around the relational bit. I think what we've seen is that's the most impactful. But I'll also throw in, my support for the fourth E, when you think about the 4 E's of learning that doesn't get as much attention, which is around the environment. So quite often when we think about learning, we think about capability uplift, we attribute it to a particular event. So whether that is a coaching or a mentoring, engagement, or whether it's a program, or whether it's a cert or a degree. But when we're thinking about the ability to learn on the fly or in the flow of work, the environmental aspects and the access to particular artifacts, etc., which will help you, perform the particular task, whether it's a human-related task or whether it's a more process-related task, I think is also something that's very worthwhile investing in, so that you've got the support outside of or over and above the event-based learning mechanisms.
Yeah, totally. Thanks.
I'm going to jump down to a question here, and bear with me. There's sort of multiple questions in this one. So it's really a question around flexibility of thought, and the person's asking, how do we audit for flexibility of thought? So, I'll take that as how are we measure in forms of a measurement is how I'll interpret that. So how are we measuring the flexibility of thought? Are we looking at what they're after? Are we looking at a range of thinking styles for the individual? Is it across the workforce? What is it that we're looking for, or organisations that you might work with, both Artie and Lainey?
Go, Artie.
So I'll answer that by, I'm not sure we are. So Lainey, I don't know if you've got a different perspective, but for me, I'm not seeing as much of, organisation-wide or even, group-wide auditing or assessment of the degree to which, one is applying flexibility in their thinking or their particular thinking style. I think there are tools out there which are used within coaching relationships or through leadership programs, but I'm not sure we're seeing as much of that.
That's right. I tend to agree that you can measure flexibility of thought through coaching, because you're talking about tactical things that people are doing within their job and challenging them around how they went about it and where they struggled and being able to build on that for them. For me, it probably still comes down to the strategy within the business and then the operating rhythm that sits in your team, or if you're a leader or if you're L&D, how are you, where in your operating rhythm do you have something that you're challenging the ability for the team to deliver on the priority? So for me, it's nearly sort of that fixed mindset, growth mindset, and when things are getting shut down or not moving forward, or problem solving, I sort of put problem solving into that. Flexibility of thought, such a big, there'd be so many different definitions of it, but I think it's where there's a safe place to be able to collaborate around innovation against the strategic priorities would be where I would kind of place it if I was sitting within a business as an OD person or an L&D person, and making sure that that's in the business somewhere, because if it's not and the operating rhythm's just rolling along and there's no ability to kind of input or hear from the team or be able to build on each other's ideas, then I would say then there's no flexibility of thought. That measuring, tricky.
Okay, I'm going to throw put out an idea of how you can actually measure flexibility of thought. Because if we break down what is it we're trying to achieve, what is it that needs to come to the table for flexibility of thought, and what is the outcome of flexibility of thought. So three things that immediately come to my mind are what enables flexibility of thought is problem solving and critical thinking. When we're looking at the outcome of it, we're looking at what's the result for the organisation, and that might even be in an area of customers, because we've seen that one. Artie, you've raised that quite a bit. One of the unique things that we do at DeakinCo is what we call our professional practice credentials. They're an experiential-based assessment. Jane knows we've worked with Jane on these. What we're doing is not measuring what someone knows, but what someone does. And so if we looked at that very issue of thought, if we were able, and we can, I shouldn't say if, we can measure at 5 different organisational levels how someone is thinking, mapped to multiple industry standards. So what is it that they're thinking? How good are they at thinking, and how are they demonstrating critical thinking? How are they demonstrating problem solving, and how are they demonstrating that they're delivering results for their organisation? If we put those 3 elements together, we'll actually be able to see and measure an actual impact of diversity of thought. So if anyone's interested in that, we can talk about it more outside of today. But there are actually ways we can start to do this in a more creative way. That is actually also underpinned by an enormous amount of research. So that is a way that actually also provides that next level up from your coaching aspect, to then have that independent measurement of how well someone is in fact performing that very function of flexibility of thought.
Yeah.
Good one.
That's a flexibility of thought question. There's a specific one for you, Jane, from a gentleman called Ian. What is CPA doing to capture, after the upskilling activities, to quantify what the individuals have embedded in their learning and how are they using it in their day-to-day work?
Good question. Okay, so what we're doing is we rolled out a capability framework and we've got our own enterprise compliance system. So what we're currently doing is looking at the functions that the CPA are performing and matching that to what the organisation as a whole it says is compliant. And at the moment, that compliance framework only consists of things like compliance with policy, compliance with technical skills, and those sorts of things. So what we're trying to do is rebuild that compliance system to say, okay, there is another element of compliance that is required, and that includes skills around people. So how do we make relationships work? How do we measure that someone has particular skills that are crucial for performing a function? So what we started with is a baseline of lots of complaints, community unhappy. We had a priority to upskill people not in the technical area, but in the area of personal relationships and how they communicate. We run and we look at many different sources of information. So we look at what people are saying in the media. What are we getting directly from the customers? We also have an independent survey that measures, things like, are you happy with the way we engage? Are you happy with the way people communicated? It's not about measuring whether or not they're happy with whether the transaction or the money that they got, are they satisfied with that? Well, we don't go there because everybody thinks their land is worth more money than they're given. So that's not what we look at. We look at how well did we interface with somebody. So we will measure that, capture that information, match it up with the compliance framework of the organisation, and then kind of look at how we've changed.
Great, thanks very much, Jane. Look, the last 2 years we've spent, not every career can do this, but a lot of careers have been working from home. So that has been a big change for all of us. Yeah. I'm interested in, perhaps this is a question to Artie, has remote working changed the diversity skills that are required by a team?
Yeah, well, I think if we go back to the opening conversation that we had around the way work is shifting, so non-routine, I think we all experienced a complete shift in our routines. So when we're talking about flexibility, of course, flexibility in relation to the skill repertoire that we required and still require, huge shift. And then if we focus on specific elements, so whether it's digital fluency or leadership, I think it becomes even more pronounced, the requirement for flexibility in skill application. And then from a diversity perspective, I think what we've seen, and this is very organisational specific, so depending on the extent to which you're multinational or national, and how connected your people are across, or how connected an organisation's people are across. But I think what we've seen is for those organisations that are in different locations, we're seeing almost like a double down on the importance of particular skills, where previously I think what we would see is many people only going to their particular location for a particular skill set or for a particular thing. What the remote working has done is it's essentially removed all barriers, which means we've now got visibility of where the various skill diversity pockets are, and broken down the walls to enable us to access those.
Thanks, Artie. Jane?
I think, Glenn, COVID has really changed the way we operate. So the government says we need to have face-to-face meetings with the community to take them through this process. But now we are doing these sorts of virtual meetings. So the challenge, I think, for this industry, L&D, is how do you develop interpersonal skills in this environment where we are close but we're not close? How do you get to know someone? How do you connect with someone when we're virtual? How do we develop the same skills that we're teaching in the classroom here? I don't have the answers, but for me to be able to connect with you, I have to concentrate very, very hard, more than I would if I was face to face. So is that a program? I don't know.
As part of this as well, we've seen, certainly from our side, we've seen a resurgence in people asking about high performing teams and how do we I suppose what they're asking for is we don't really want to go back into the model of high performing teams, but what they're asking for is actually that very thing, the magic of what's the capability mix of a high performing team and how do we get it back, but let's not call it a high performing team. What's your response, panelists, and anyone can jump in, of how do we get and grow that capability mix that we've seen and heard about in high performing teams?
I think the one thing I would add from sort of a bit of a different perspective, which I've talked about before, is around managing and developing the whole person now. So, we very much were focused on developing someone from 9 to 5, or 7 till 8, whatever our working hours are. But I think one thing, certainly in the work that I do with Carmen's, is managing the whole person, and we shouldn't lose sight of that now as we move into a different phase of the pandemic. The importance of being able to build human skills that far beyond just what we do at work, but what we do at home, because I feel that's not going to change now in the ways that we work. And I think Jane sort of unconsciously said it, who would have thought that we'd run a program on connectedness? We want you to be connected. Like we just, that would have been something that, opt in or out. If you want to be more connected, we're running a program. But now that is so important in this hybrid working space that we go into. And it will depend on the type of workplace you have. For those that are going complete remote, those that are hybrid, I don't think many are, fully back at work. But I think they're the things that we need to think about from my perspective, when we're looking at high performing teams and how we can help people be better in their whole life and balanced in their whole life, that then allows them to be amazing when they're at work.
Thanks, Lainey. Artie or Jane, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, for us, we defined what a high-performing team looked like through our capability framework. So we said there are 3 types of skills that these people need to have, and they may, at a minimum, they must have these things. They must display these qualities or have this sort of experience. And then it can only get better from there. So what we said is, here is what we want our people to look like. You can mix it. You can mix those skills as you like, depending on the complexity of the work that they need to do. However, no one should come into the industry unless they display everything that we say here, including, and we made this absolutely critical, interpersonal skills, the ability to work with others, the ability to listen, the ability to adapt, the ability to be flexible. Those sorts of things are critical in the work that these people do.
Thanks, Jane.
So I agree with both Jane and with Lainey and yourself, Glenn, in relation to, so your opening point was we've seen an explosion in relation to interest associated with high performing teams. I think we're all seeing it in relation to different leaders wanting to drive or to look at the high performing team concept during this pandemic that we're in and thinking about it moving forward. I think the other component which I would be focusing on when thinking about high performing teams is the dynamic processes that exist across the team. So I think this is what Jane was getting at from a capability lens. I think there's also an underlying piece as well associated with trust. So how do you build and maintain trust in an environment such as the one that we're operating in at the moment through this conversation?
There's a couple more questions that I'd like to get on in these last sort of five minutes that we have. And the really good one here from someone around the role of operational leaders in training their employees. And the question is really around how do we influence the operational level leadership to get involved in and committed to the training within their own environments. there special, are there different techniques? I know we've, it's certainly throughout my career, it's been an area where we've seen some of the issues come up is getting that engagement from some line managers. What techniques or tools have you used to help get to overcome that?
Well, for us, we have to deal with lots of different agencies. So it's about getting leadership buy-in. They need to understand the importance of it. So an explanation of the framework, things that have been perhaps overlooked in terms of individual staff development and explaining what's available. So you really need to be able to say, here's what we think good looks like in terms of how do we do better in terms of customer service. Here's the solution. There's not much thinking involved, so we're trying to minimise the amount of work that they need to do and then give them a pathway. But leadership, what I'd say key is leadership buy-in.
Yeah, I would totally agree, obviously, leader-led, but really, expectation. Mm-hmm. What's it, the expectation, the intent of your role within the broader strategy to be able to deliver what we want to deliver for this organisation. So that answered for leaders, so they understand their role in that, and that if they're not stepping up to the plate, that they're sabotaging the overarching strategy and won't be able to deliver what the business needs to deliver in that respect. And I guess that's making sure that they understand that that's their role within that.
Yeah, thanks, Lainey. And I think I really, the part there that really resonates is around expectation of role. And I think this is one of the things that we do, particularly in those sort of what I'd call line management and transitional roles into leadership. We actually forget to tell people that go from a technical role to a managerial role that their job has fundamentally changed. And that, in fact, now the core part of their job is people management and performance management. And that's performance of people and non-people matters. And I think this very issue comes back down to making sure that our managers and our leaders understand that a big part of their job is about developing people and performance.
And I'll add to that when we talk about tools, and that's where I feel that leaders, operational leaders, one of the biggest capabilities is around teaching them to be mentors. So, they're able to access their experiences versus telling people how to do their job, but being able to work with the person to mentor them through what they've done before.
Thanks. There is one last question, and I might just limit this to one person to reply. So whoever gets in first. And this is a question around ethics and integrity in your case. So what priority do you place on ethics and integrity in your capability frameworks? And how do you deliver and assess these attributes? So ethics and integrity in organisations and their capability frameworks.
God, that's a minefield. I would say ethics and integrity, again, it's around expectation. Everyone comes from a different point of view. Everyone has different values. So in some ways it's linked back to the values and people understanding what the values of the organisation are, to be able to know what integrity is for the organisation versus integrity for themselves, because sometimes that can be very different. So again, I keep linking it back to expectation, but I'm sure others have different views.
I would answer in a similar way, but maybe use different words. So when I think about ethics and integrity, so for any skill or capability, I think what's paramount is the ability to be able to articulate what it looks like when it's done well. So if you've got a broader taxonomy or a framework or what have you, I think ethics absolutely has a place there from the lens of, well, what does it look like when you're applying or when you're demonstrating ethical behaviour or integrity as per what the expectations of the organisation are, because then that also gives you the anchors from which you can assess and measure in a way which is not linked to the individual's attributes or values per se.
Thanks very much, Artie. And I want to thank all of you, all three of you panellists, Lainey, Jane and Artie. This has been a good and insightful conversation, and I hope you, our audience, have also found it valuable. Today, we've explored issues around diversity, certainly the importance of diversity of skills, around non-routine skills, around the consistency of the application of those skills. We talked about communication, leadership and flexibility in thought, but we also brought in some of the more pertinent common ones that are being asked for around customer, digital literacy and leadership. We've talked and discussed the role of communication and the importance of that within the workplace as a big skill. How do we recognise if we've got the right mix? We've touched on that as well. And as leaders, how we go about getting that right mix of capability within our workplace. As I mentioned, and just a reminder, that research that I've touched on will be coming out. We will post information on our LinkedIn profile and our other social media avenues, just as you found out about today's collab session. But as a final piece and sign off at 2:30, I'd like to say to each of you, thank you, Artie. Thanks, Jane. And thanks, Lainey.